There are moments when life feels like it belongs to someone else. You are sitting at a table, laughing with people you love, or walking through a city you have lived in for years, or lying in bed at the end of a perfectly ordinary day. And yet, something is slightly off. Not broken, not painful, just distant. Like you are watching yourself from just a few steps behind, present, but not quite there. Going through the motions of a life that looks right from the outside, but somehow doesn't feel like yours from the inside. You recognize the apartment, the routine, the face in the mirror. But do you recognize the person living inside all of it? It didn't start yesterday. This feeling of being slightly outside yourself, of living a life that fits but doesn't quite feel, didn't arrive one morning without warning. It grew slowly, the way a river changes its course. So gradually that by the time you noticed, the landscape had already shifted. It started when you were very young, not with anything dramatic, not with a single moment you can point to and say, that's where it happened. It started with something much quieter. The discovery that who you are and who you need to appear to be are not always the same thing. As children, we are extraordinarily sensitive. We read the room before we can read words. We learn early which parts of ourselves make the people around us comfortable and which parts do not. A child who is too loud learns to be quieter. A child who feels too much learns to smile anyway. A child who is curious about the wrong things learns to ask different questions. None of this is anyone's fault. Parents are doing their best. Teachers are managing rooms full of small, complex humans. Society has expectations that existed long before any of us arrived. But the effect is the same. We begin to edit ourselves. We tuck certain feelings away. We perform a version of who we are that is easier for the world to receive. Psychologists call this the false self, a constructed identity built not from the inside out, but from the outside in. It is the self shaped by approval, by safety, by the need to belong, and it is extraordinarily useful. Without it, we cannot navigate the social world at all. But here is what no one tells you. The false self is a costume you put on so early and wear so consistently that one day you forget there was ever anything underneath. A woman once described it this way. She said that growing up, she was always the calm one, the one who never cried, never complained, never needed anything. Her family relied on her steadiness. So she became steady. She performed steadiness so well for so long that by the time she reached her 30s, she genuinely could not tell whether she was calm or whether she had simply stopped allowing herself to feel anything that wasn't. That is the origin of the stranger feeling. It is not madness. It is not weakness. It is the completely logical result of a process that began when you were too young to choose otherwise. You learned to survive by becoming someone the world could accept. And you were so good at it, so thorough, so consistent, that the distance between the performed self and the real self quietly became your normal. The mask was never meant to stay forever. But masks, worn long enough, begin to feel like skin, and the face beneath them, the one that existed before the editing, before the performing, before the learning to be acceptable, starts to feel like a stranger. So the mask becomes skin. And then something else happens. Life begins to build itself around the mask. This is the part that rarely gets talked about. The way that once we have constructed a version of ourselves for the world responds to that version. It offers it opportunities. It gives it a role. It hands it a life. And slowly, without any single dramatic decision, we find ourselves living inside a structure that was built for someone we were pretending to be. Think about how it happens. You choose a career path that felt sensible, or that impressed people, or that someone you respected said would suit you. You settle into a city, a relationship, a routine. You develop a reputation among the people around you. The responsible one, the funny one, the one who always knows what to do. And those reputations become expectations. And expectations become walls. Comfortable walls, perhaps. But walls nonetheless. Sociologists have a term for this: role engulfment, the process by which a social role gradually absorbs a person's entire identity. It was first described in the context of illness and caregiving, but it applies far more broadly when a role, professional, relational, social, becomes the primary lens through which a person sees themselves. Everything outside that role begins to feel irrelevant. or worse, threatening. You become your job title, your relationship status, your reputation in the room. And the parts of you that don't fit those categories, the stranger parts, the softer parts, the parts that wanted something different, get quietly filed away as impractical. A man in his early 40s once described waking up one morning and realizing he could not remember the last time he had done something purely because he wanted to. Not because it was useful. Not because it impressed anyone. Not because it fit the image he had built over 2 decades of careful, consistent performance. Just because he wanted to. He sat with that realization for a long time. It wasn't grief, exactly. It was more like discovering a room in your house you had completely forgotten existed. That room had always been there. He had simply stopped going in. This is what the system formation does. It doesn't destroy who you are. It just makes the authentic self increasingly inconvenient. The routines you build, the roles you inhabit, the identity you project, they all reward consistency. They reward staying the same. And so you stay the same. You maintain the version of yourself that the structure requires. Not because you're dishonest, but because the structure makes it genuinely difficult to be anything else. And here's the quiet irony at the heart of all of this. The life you have built is not bad. It may even be good by almost any external measure. Stable, recognizable, respected, but it was designed around a self that was never entirely real. And somewhere beneath the routine, beneath the role, beneath the years of accumulated identity, something knows, something has always known. And that knowing, that quiet, persistent knowing, is exhausting. Not in the way that hard work is exhausting. Not the kind of tired that a good night's sleep can fix. This is a deeper kind of fatigue, the kind that lives in the chest rather than the body. The kind that is still there on Monday morning even after a restful weekend. Even after a holiday. Even after a life that, by all visible measures, is going well. It is the exhaustion of maintenance. Because living as a stranger in your own life requires constant effort. Every day you manage the gap between who you feel like on the inside and who you're expected to be on the outside. You show up. You perform. You say the right things in the right rooms. You hold the shape of the person everyone has come to rely on. And you do it so naturally, so automatically, that most of the time you don't even notice you are doing it. Until suddenly, you do. There are moments when the gap becomes impossible to ignore. A friend shares exciting news and you smile. But behind the smile, there is nothing. Not envy, not joy, not indifference. Just a strange blankness, like a signal that isn't connecting. Or you are asked a simple question, what do you want? And you realize, with a shock that feels almost embarrassing, that you genuinely do not know. Not because the question is complicated, but because you have spent so long wanting what you were supposed to want that the original signal has gone quiet. This is the hidden cost. Not crisis, not collapse, just a slow dimming. A young woman described sitting at her own birthday dinner, surrounded by people who loved her, and feeling completely invisible, not because they ignored her, but because the person they were celebrating, the person they toasted and laughed with and sang to, felt like someone she had read about once. Someone whose life she understood intellectually, but could not feel from the inside. She went home that night and cried, and couldn't explain why. Because nothing had gone wrong. Everything had gone exactly right. That is perhaps the most disorienting part of this experience. It carries no obvious cause. There is no villain, no clear moment of loss. Just a growing suspicion that somewhere along the way between all the adapting and performing and maintaining, you misplaced something essential, something you can't quite name, but whose absence you feel in the quietest moments, late at night or in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, when the noise stops and there is nothing left to distract you from yourself. And in those moments, the stranger feeling is loudest, not because something is breaking, but because something buried under years of careful, well-intentioned construction is still alive, still there, still waiting with remarkable patience for you to finally stop performing long enough to remember it exists. And yet, we rarely stop. Because the world we live in is extraordinarily good at making sure we don't. This is not a conspiracy. No one designed it this way on purpose. But the modern world, with all its speed and noise and endless stimulation, functions almost perfectly as a system for keeping you away from yourself. Not violently, not obviously, just consistently. The way a river is kept from going still by the constant movement of water. We fill every quiet moment before it has a chance to become uncomfortable. A notification arrives before the thought can deepen. A scroll replaces a silence. A new task appears before the last feeling has been fully felt, and we welcome these interruptions. Not because we are weak, but because the alternative, sitting alone with the stranger inside, feels far more unsettling than any amount of noise. Researchers studying attention and well-being have found that people, when given a choice, often prefer mild discomfort over sitting quietly with their own thoughts. In one study, participants chose to give themselves small electric shocks rather than spend 15 minutes alone in silence. The finding sounds absurd, but most of us, if we are honest, understand it completely. Stillness is where the stranger lives, and busyness has become the socially accepted way to avoid him. But it goes further than distraction. Modern life doesn't just offer escape from the self. It actively rewards a particular kind of self-performance. Social media, professional networking, personal branding, all of it asks the same quiet question: who are you, and can you make it legible? Can you compress your identity into something consistent, attractive, shareable? Can you be a coherent product? And so we curate, we select, we present the version of ourselves that generates the most warmth, the most recognition, the most sense of belonging. Online and offline, the performance continues. The mask doesn't come off when you close the app. It simply adjusts for the next audience. A man in his late 20s described checking his own social media profile during a difficult week. Not to post anything, just to look. He said it felt steadying somehow to see himself reflected back as someone who looked purposeful and interesting and fine. The profile felt more real in that moment than the person sitting alone in his apartment feeling lost. He knew, rationally, that the profile was a selection, but the selection felt safer than the truth. This is what normalization looks like. It is not dramatic. It is just the default. The path of least resistance, the way things are. And because everyone around us is doing some version of the same thing, the disconnection never quite reads as a problem. It reads as adulthood, as maturity, as being a functional person in a busy world. We have built a civilization that is masterful at movement and almost completely unpracticed at stillness. So the stranger waits, patient as ever, buried under the calendar and the feed and the endless, comfortable noise, quietly wondering when you will finally come home. So, how do you come home? This is the question that arrives naturally at this point. And it is a good question, but before we try to answer it, we need to question the question itself. Because the way we ask it already contains an assumption that the self is something lost, somewhere out there, waiting to be retrieved, that if you search hard enough, dig deep enough, work on yourself consistently enough, you will eventually find it again. But what if that is not how it works? What if the self was never lost? What if it has simply been buried, not destroyed, not gone, not broken, but covered, layer by layer, by years of performance and adaptation and maintenance? And what if returning to it is not a journey outward, toward some distant destination, but a journey inward, toward what is already, quietly, present? The philosopher Lao Tzu wrote something that has stayed with people for over 2,000 years. He suggested that the greatest thing a person can do is not to achieve or to accumulate, but simply to return, to come back to the natural state that was always there before the world began reshaping it. He called it returning to the root, not building something new, just clearing away what was never really you. That image is worth sitting with. Because so much of modern self-improvement assumes that you need to add something, a new habit, a new perspective, a new, better version of yourself. But the stranger feeling is rarely caused by a lack of something. It is caused by an excess of performance, of maintenance, of distance between what you feel and what you allow yourself to show. Returning to yourself, then, is not an achievement. It is a practice of subtraction. It begins in small moments. The moment you let a feeling exist without immediately managing it. The moment you answer a question honestly, even if the honest answer is, I don't know. The moment you do something, anything, not because it is useful or impressive or expected, but simply because it is true to what you are. These moments are quiet. They don't look like breakthroughs. They don't make good stories for social media. But they are the moments when the distance closes, not all at once. Gradually, the way morning light fills a room, not dramatically, not in a single instant, but steadily, until at some point you look up and realize you can see clearly again. My friends, feeling like a stranger in your own life is not a flaw. It is not a failure. It is the honest result of growing up in a world that asked you to be many things before it ever asked you who you actually were. But the person underneath all of that, the one who existed before the editing, before the performing, before the learning to be acceptable, is still there. They have always been there, waiting, not with frustration, but with the quiet patience of something that knows it cannot be permanently replaced, only temporarily forgotten. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and stay curious.